What if you could talk to someone from the 1930s? So, time travel. Well, I have, and I asked them to predict what life would be like in 2026. I think that, in the year 2026, life will be pleasant and easy. In the first place, the world will be inhabited all over, for by that time, people will have discovered the art of flying. In the next place, all wars will have ceased, for nations will have learned to live in peace and amity with each other. We will have acquired knowledge in all sorts of sciences and be perfectly skilled in the art of healing. We will be honest and good neighbours, and robbers will be unknown. In short, I think the world will, in the year 2026, be a very pleasant place to live in. I think those were some really nice predictions, so it's a bit of a shame only a few of them came true, and talking about being truthful, I may have lied a little bit. Sorry, but I didn't invent time travel. Instead, this was actually Talkie, which is a 13 billion parameter language model trained on pre-1931 text. So it doesn't even know that there's a Second World War, and it gives some truly fascinating, wild, and offensive answers, and can even be taught to code. So Talkie here is what's known as a vintage model, and Talkie appears to be the biggest of its kind. One of the researchers on this was actually the lead author on OpenAI's GPT research in 2018, which formed the very foundation of ChatGPT. He's also worked on DALL-E and Whisper, so that is a seriously impressive CV. What they've done is made a 13 billion parameter network trained exclusively on 260 billion tokens of historical English text, so old newspapers, patents, scientific journals, and books. 1931 is the cutoff, by the way, because the US copyright cutoff is the end of 1930, so they're not going to get sued by Big Mouse for doing this. And besides just being fun to talk to, these vintage models also serve a research purpose. Today, every big model like ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini, they're all trained on the modern web, which makes it almost impossible to figure out if an AI is actually thinking and reasoning, or if it's just memorized an answer from a random Reddit thread, and that Reddit thread was probably AI generated. So if we use a model that only knows pre-1931 text, it's not going to have any of that contamination. I mean, let's try this out and ask it something like, what is the internet? Here we can see it's seemingly got the internet confused with the internal revenue tax levied upon articles of consumption, so it has no idea what the modern internet is. Another fun one is to ask it what popular slang words are. Apparently in 1930 they were bosh, rot, bosh again, stuff, nonsense, fudge, gammon, humbug, brack, fla, and ribaldry. I hope I haven't said anything rude there. And the reason having no contamination is useful is because it lets researchers understand if AI can actually learn new things, like learning to code. This model doesn't even know what a computer is. As far as it's concerned, it's a human that does computation. That's why it's pretty impressive that when given a few examples of Python programs, it could actually learn to write new ones, even if it was just mostly simple one-line programs. When using some basic human eval Python tests and providing it with random Python functions in its context, it actually managed to pass these tests a few times when given 100 chances. In this case, Talkie correctly understood that to make the decode function, it simply needed to swap an addition for a subtraction. Well, pretty simple, that shows an understanding of inverse functions, and that's new knowledge. It hasn't seen any of these before. If you try the same thing on a modern LLM of a similar size, it's going to massively outperform Talkie, but that was pretty obvious. Another thing that researchers can test with these vintage models is the ability to predict the future. Now this might get a little unhinged, but let's ask it, will there be another war? So it says that it doesn't think there'll be another war in Europe, and I don't have the heart to tell it just how wrong it is. I'm also curious now what it thinks of a certain Austrian man. Yeah, this one is pretty terrible. It says it's going to be an extraordinary personality, and also down here that Germany is going to be a far more efficient administration when he's leading it. Honestly, no words. No. Now, researchers obviously do this in a way more scientific way than the way that I just did it. They actually calculated the surprisingness of short descriptions of historical events taken from the New York Times On This Day feature. Doing this, you can see an increase in surprisingness after the 1931 knowledge cutoff, and it spikes into the 50s and 60s, so it's found that those events are pretty unbelievable. Research like this lets them see how forecasting performance improves with model size and also decays at longer horizons. You can also use this to test if models are able to come up with new ideas, because you can ask it about patents or papers that were created after 1931 and see if it can discover them on its own. Overall, these vintage models might let researchers distinguish how much a model's behavior is actually from the dataset that it's trained on, and talking about training, making a pure 1931 model is no easy feat. One of the hardest problems is temporal leakage, aka you don't want information from after 1931 to be included. Talkie, for example, does seem to have a few cases of this, where it knows who the president was in 1936, and also a few of the policies that he created. There are several ways this could have happened. For example, when dealing with modern documents, so the scans of the older documents could have just had the wrong metadata attached to it, so it had the wrong date. They can also be post hoc additions, like editorial introductions and footnotes. That data filtering is actually something they're still working on and refining this to try and eliminate the problem. The other problem they had is that documents from 1931 look like this, and while OCR is pretty damn good these days, they only achieved 30% of the performance of a model trained on human transcribed versions of the same text. So that is going to be a lot of manual work, and while they did use some regex to clean up some of the common mistakes, this only brought its performance up to 70%. So they're actually working on a new vintage OCR system. Finally, it's also a massive challenge to post-train a vintage model because there is no ready-made post-training data for them. And if they use a modern one, they'll end up baking in some of the knowledge, style, and expressions of what a modern-day chat assistant should be like. So the researchers actually had to make their own from old etiquette manuals, letter writing manuals, cookbooks, dictionaries, encyclopedias, and even poetry and fables. Once you've done that though, you also need to train the model on instruction following and actually conversing, so you need to use some reinforcement learning, but the problem with that is that the model starts to adjust its output to whatever the judge wants, and we don't have a judge from the 1930s, so they actually used Claude Sonnet 4.6. The issue is though, a modern model likes its answers in the format of a 2026 chatbot, so styles apparently did start to leak into the 1931 model, like listicles. This is pretty much unavoidable, but they are hoping in the future that they can use vintage-based models as the judges to fix this. They're actually already training a GPT-3 level vintage model, and they say that 1 trillion tokens of historical text is actually achievable, which would put them at the original ChatGPT capability, just with 1930s knowledge. So go and try out Talkie and let me know in the comments if you get any weird or unhinged responses. While you're down there, subscribe, and as always, see you in the next one.